Evelyn stepped out of her small apartment, the early morning air heavy with the promise of another long, wearisome day. The city buzzed around her, a relentless hum of life that seemed to move too quickly for someone like her, someone whose days had slowed to a crawl under the weight of years and sorrows. Her skin, the deep, rich brown of someone who had seen more than her share of life, caught the soft light filtering through the trees lining the sidewalk. She was a woman of age, not just in years, but in experience, every wrinkle a silent testament to the battles fought and the resilience earned. The streets were already alive with activity, yet Evelyn felt a profound sense of isolation. People rushed past her, faces buried in phones, eyes fixed on destinations beyond her presence. She walked with a slow, deliberate pace, her cane tapping a quiet rhythm on the concrete. The world around her felt distant, as if she were moving through a film of invisible barriers, separating her from the thrumming energy of the city. As she approached the subway entrance, Evelyn's thoughts drifted back to the visit she had made the day before. The memories clung to her like a persistent shadow, unwelcome and unshakable. Her daughter's face, etched with the same lines of worry and grief that mirrored her own, haunted her thoughts. The loss of her grandson had been a blow too great to bear, and the remnants of that sorrow still lingered in every corner of her mind. Evelyn stepped onto the crowded subway car, the metallic clang of the closing doors echoing behind her. The car was packed, as it always was at this hour, with bodies pressed together in a confined space, each person isolated within their own world. The hum of the train moving along the tracks was punctuated by the rustle of newspapers, the tinny buzz of music leaking from headphones, and the low murmur of conversations spoken in hushed tones. She found a narrow space to stand, clutching the overhead strap for support. Around her, the city's morning crowd was engaged in its usual routine, eyes glued to glowing screens, fingers scrolling through endless streams of information. Some passengers stared blankly out the windows, their thoughts a million miles away. No one seemed to notice Evelyn's presence. She was just another face in the crowd, an anonymous figure in the sea of daily commuters. The subway jerked forward, and Evelyn tightened her grip on the strap, trying to steady herself. The train was moving, but for her, time felt frozen. Her thoughts were consumed by the recent loss, the sorrow she carried like a heavy stone in her chest. It was a weight that she couldn't seem to shake, no matter how hard she tried. The faces of her daughter and grandson lingered in her mind, their absence a void that nothing could fill. She glanced around the car, hoping to find something, anything to distract her from the relentless ache. But all she saw were strangers, each one wrapped up in their own lives, their own concerns. A young woman was tapping furiously on her phone, her brow furrowed in concentration. An older man across from her was hidden behind a newspaper, only the top of his balding head visible. A group of teenagers huddled near the door, their laughter ringing out in sharp contrast to the silence Evelyn felt inside. The train rattled on, carrying its passengers to their destinations, oblivious to the quiet despair in their midst. Evelyn lowered her eyes, staring at the worn leather of her handbag, her fingers tracing the familiar grooves. It was a small comfort, a link to a time when life had been different, when there had been joy and laughter. But now, even that seemed distant, almost like a dream. The train lurched as it approached the next station, and the crowd shifted, bodies brushing against each other as people prepared to disembark. Evelyn didn't move. She had nowhere to go, no reason to rush. She was just another passenger, just another day. The doors slid open, and a fresh wave of commuters poured in, filling the spaces left by those who had exited. The noise level rose, a cacophony of voices and movement, but it all faded into the background for Evelyn. She was alone, surrounded by people, but utterly alone. The world moved on around her, and she was left behind, trapped in her grief, invisible to the world. The subway doors slid open with a metallic hiss, and three young men sauntered in, their voices loud and abrasive, shattering the fragile silence that had settled over the car. They moved with a swagger, their presence demanding attention as they squeezed into the space near Evelyn, who sat quietly, eyes downcast, trying to make herself as small as possible. At first, their conversation was typical of young men, banter about sports, weekend plans, and the latest gossip. Their laughter was coarse, jarring in the otherwise subdued environment. The other passengers, entrenched in their own worlds, did little more than glance up briefly before returning to their screens and newspapers. Evelyn kept her head low, her grip on the handle of her handbag tightening as she sensed their proximity. She hoped they would remain oblivious to her, just another passenger blending into the background. But it wasn't long before their eyes fell on her, and the tone of their conversation shifted. "Hey, check out the old lady over there," one of them said, nudging his friend and jerking his chin in Evelyn's direction. His voice dripped with mockery, laced with an edge that made Evelyn's stomach turn. The second man smirked, leaning closer. "What's wrong, Grandma? Lose your way to the nursing home?" Evelyn felt a wave of heat rise in her chest, but she kept her gaze firmly on the floor, willing herself to disappear. She had encountered this kind of cruelty before. Mean-spirited, baseless, and directed at her for no other reason than she was an easy target. She knew better than to engage, but their words cut deep, reopening old wounds she had tried so hard to heal. The third man joined in, his voice louder, more insistent. "Look at her. Probably doesn't even know where she is. What's the matter, old lady? Cat got your tongue?" Their laughter rang out, sharp and cruel, bouncing off the walls of the subway car. Evelyn could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, brief flickers of pity or discomfort before they turned away, pretending not to hear, not to see. It was easier for them to ignore it, to keep their heads down and avoid getting involved. After all, they had their own lives, their own problems. What did it matter if an old woman was being humiliated right in front of them? The men grew bolder, encouraged by Evelyn's silence and the apathy of those around them. They began to mock her appearance, her age, the color of her skin. Their words were venomous, laced with the kind of casual racism that stung all the more for its careless delivery. They made jokes about her being invisible in the dark, about how she probably had a broomstick hidden somewhere to sweep up after them. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, each insult a blow that left her breathless. She wanted to shout, to tell them to stop, but the words lodged in her throat, trapped by years of conditioning that had taught her to endure, to survive by not making waves. She knew that speaking up would only make things worse, would turn their mockery into something more dangerous, more personal. The train sped on, the city passing by in a blur outside the windows. Inside, time seemed to stretch, each second weighed down by the tension that filled the air. The men, emboldened by the lack of resistance, leaned in closer, their voices growing louder, more menacing. They were predators, circling their prey, waiting for her to break. Kelly sat across from Evelyn, her eyes flicking between the older woman and the three young men. She had noticed them the moment they boarded the train. Loud, brash, the kind of arrogance that dared anyone to challenge them. At first, she had tried to ignore them, burying herself in her thoughts. But it wasn't long before their voices cut through the low hum of the subway car, drawing her attention back to the scene unfolding before her. It didn't take long for her to realize what was happening. The way the men zeroed in on Evelyn, their sneers, the mockery in their voices. It was all too familiar. Kelly had seen this before, in different forms, in different places. It was the kind of behavior that thrived on silence, on the assumption that no one would dare to intervene. But Kelly was not someone who could sit quietly while others were being hurt. She had been trained for moments like this, though in another life, another context. As a former member of the Special Forces, Kelly had faced down threats far more dangerous than a group of bullies on a subway. But the principles were the same. You didn't stand by while someone was in danger. You didn't let cruelty go unchecked. The men were growing bolder, their laughter louder, more malicious. They leaned in closer to Evelyn, their words sharper, meant to wound. Kelly felt a surge of anger, a deep, protective instinct that had been honed through years of service. She could see the tension in Evelyn's posture, the way the older woman tried to make herself smaller, to disappear. It was a reaction Kelly understood, but it only fueled her determination to act. She waited, her breath steady, her heart rate even. Timing was everything. She didn't want to escalate the situation too soon, but she couldn't let it continue either. The other passengers had already made their decision. They were content to look away, to pretend they didn't hear the insults being thrown around. But Kelly couldn't do that. She had never been able to turn a blind eye to injustice. One of the men leaned in even closer to Evelyn, his voice dropping to a low, threatening whisper that sent a chill down Kelly's spine. That was the breaking point. Kelly stood up, her movements controlled and deliberate. She wasn't a large woman, but there was a quiet power in the way she carried herself, a confidence that came from knowing exactly what she was capable of. "Hey," she said, her voice cutting through the noise with a calm authority that demanded attention. The men looked up, startled. They hadn't expected anyone to challenge them, least of all a young woman who didn't seem to have any backup. But there was something in Kelly's eyes, something that gave them pause. "This stops now," Kelly continued, her tone leaving no room for argument. The man closest to Evelyn sneered, trying to recover his bravado. "Or what?" Kelly didn't flinch. She took a step closer, her gaze locked onto his. "Or I make you stop." There was a beat of silence, the air thick with tension. The other passengers were watching now, their earlier apathy replaced with a mix of curiosity and unease. The men exchanged glances, their earlier confidence wavering. They hadn't counted on someone standing up to them, especially not someone who looked so sure of herself. Kelly didn't wait for them to decide. She moved with the kind of precision that only came from years of training, positioning herself between Evelyn and the men, her stance ready, prepared for whatever might come next. The men hesitated, sensing the shift in power, the way Kelly commanded the space around her. "We were just having some fun," one of them muttered, but the edge in his voice was gone. "Find another way to have fun," Kelly replied, her voice steady, unyielding. "And leave her alone." Kelly stood her ground, her eyes locked on the three young men who had been tormenting Evelyn. The tension in the subway car was palpable, the air thick with an uneasy silence. The men who moments ago had been so loud and brash now hesitated, unsure of how to react to this unexpected challenge. One of the men, the one who had been the most vocal, sneered at her. "Who do you think you are?" he spat, trying to reclaim his dominance. "This doesn't concern you." Kelly didn't flinch. "It concerns everyone when you're bullying an innocent person," she replied calmly. "Now, back off." The man's sneer faltered, but he wasn't ready to back down. He took a step toward Kelly, trying to use his size to intimidate her. "You think you're tough?" he taunted. "You think you can take us on?" Kelly's expression didn't change. She had faced threats far more dangerous than this. Her training had taught her not just how to fight, but how to remain composed under pressure, how to read an opponent's intentions before they even acted. She could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the way his bravado was beginning to crack. "Don't make this harder on yourself," Kelly warned, her voice low but firm. "Walk away. But the man didn't listen. He lunged at her, his hand reaching out as if to grab her arm. It was a clumsy move, one fueled by anger rather than skill, and Kelly was ready for it. With a swift, practiced motion, she sidestepped his grasp, pivoting on her heel to leverage his momentum against him. Before he knew what was happening, Kelly had him pinned against the wall of the subway car, his arm twisted behind his back in a hold that left him immobilized. The man let out a grunt of pain, his face contorting as he struggled to break free. But Kelly held him firmly, her grip unyielding. The other two men, who had been watching in stunned silence, took a step back, their confidence rapidly evaporating. "Let him go!" one of them shouted, but there was no force behind the words, only a rising fear. Kelly glanced at him, her eyes cold and assessing. "He brought this on himself," she said evenly. "And if you try anything, you'll get the same." The tension in the car was thick, the other passengers watching in a mix of shock and disbelief. Kelly could sense their eyes on her, the way the dynamic had shifted. No longer were these men in control of the situation. That power now lay in her hands. "Apologize to her," Kelly demanded, tightening her hold just enough to make her point clear. The man pinned against the wall groaned, his bravado completely shattered. Okay, he gasped, desperation creeping into his voice. "I'm sorry. We're sorry." Kelly held him there for a moment longer, ensuring the sincerity of his words before she finally released him. He stumbled forward, rubbing his arm, glaring at Kelly with a mixture of fear and resentment. But he made no move to retaliate. The fight had been taken out of him. Kelly returned to her seat, her expression calm as if nothing had happened. But inside she knew this moment was significant. She had stood up, not just for Evelyn, but for anyone who had ever been on the receiving end of such cruelty. The train pulled into the station with a grinding halt, the screech of metal on metal echoing through the car. The doors slid open, and two uniformed security officers stepped in, their eyes scanning the tense faces of the passengers. They moved with purpose, their presence a reminder that order would be restored, no matter the disruption. Kelly, still seated with an air of calm authority, raised a hand to signal the officers. "Over here," she said, her voice clear and composed. The officers approached, their gazes shifting from Kelly to the three young men, who now stood huddled together near the door, their earlier bravado replaced with a nervous energy. One of the officers, a broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, turned to Kelly. "What happened here?" Kelly remained seated, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp. "Three were harassing an elderly woman," she explained, her tone measured, devoid of any unnecessary emotion. "They crossed the line. I intervened to protect her." The officer nodded, taking in Kelly's words. He looked at the men, who were now shifting uneasily on their feet. "Is that true?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority. The ringleader, the one who had been most aggressive, hesitated before nodding reluctantly. "Yeah, we were just messing around, though. Didn't mean anything by it." The officer's expression hardened. "Messing around?" he repeated, his tone flat. "You think it's fun to terrorize someone who can't defend themselves?" None of the men responded, their eyes fixed on the floor. The officer sighed, shaking his head. "You're coming with us," he said, gesturing for them to step off the train. As they were escorted out, Kelly watched them go, her face unreadable. She didn't take any pleasure in their humiliation, but she knew this was the only way to ensure they wouldn't harm anyone else. Justice had to be done, even if it was as simple as removing a threat from a public space. When the men were gone, the officer turned back to Kelly. "Thank you for stepping in," he said, his tone softer now. "Not everyone would have had the courage to do that. Kelly nodded, accepting his thanks with a simple, "You're welcome." She didn't need praise. She had done what she believed was right. As the officers moved on to speak with other passengers, Kelly finally turned her attention to Evelyn. The older woman had been silent throughout the entire exchange, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. She looked up at Kelly with eyes full of gratitude and something else. Relief, perhaps, or maybe even a sense of awe. "Thank you," Evelyn said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Kelly offered her a small, reassuring smile. "You're safe now," she replied. "That's all that matters." Evelyn nodded, but there was more she wanted to say. She hesitated, searching for the right words. I don't usually take this train," she admitted, her voice faltering. "But today, I just needed to be somewhere else. Anywhere else." Kelly understood. She didn't ask for more details, sensing that Evelyn wasn't ready to share the full weight of her burden just yet. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, scribbling something on a page before tearing it out and handing it to Evelyn. "This is my number," Kelly said. "If you ever need anything, someone to talk to, someone to help, you can call me." Evelyn took the paper, holding it as if it were something precious. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "You don't need to," Kelly replied, gently. "Just take care of yourself, okay?" Evelyn nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek, though she quickly wiped it away. "I will," she promised. As the train prepared to depart, Kelly and Evelyn exchanged one last look, a silent understanding passing between them. As the train pulled away from the station, Kelly leaned back in her seat, watching the city blur past the window. She knew this wasn't the end, but rather the beginning of something new, for both of them. The days that followed the confrontation on the subway were a whirlwind for Kelly. What she had thought of as a simple act of standing up for someone in need quickly grew into something far larger. The video of the incident, recorded by a passenger on their phone, spread rapidly across social media, capturing the attention of thousands. Soon, Kelly found herself at the center of a conversation she hadn't anticipated, but could not ignore. At first, the messages started trickling in, thank you notes from strangers, offers of support from community members, and requests for interviews from local news outlets. Kelly, never one to seek the spotlight, was hesitant. She had done what she believed anyone should do in that situation, but the world seemed to think differently. The attention felt overwhelming, but there was a growing realization that she had touched on something much deeper, a collective yearning for justice, for courage in the face of apathy. A few days later, Kelly received a call from an organization that specialized in combating racism and promoting social justice. They had seen the video and were impressed by how she handled the situation. The voice on the other end was warm but insistent, urging Kelly to consider taking her stand beyond that subway car. "We need more people like you," the woman said. "People who can inspire others to act, to make a difference. Would you be interested in sharing your story, maybe even leading some self-defense workshops?" Kelly hesitated. The idea of speaking in front of large groups, of becoming a public figure, was daunting. But as she thought back to Evelyn and the fear in the old woman's eyes that day, she knew this was an opportunity she couldn't turn away from. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that," she admitted. "But if it can help others, I'm willing to try." And so, Kelly embarked on a new journey. Her first speaking engagement was small, a local community center filled with a mix of curious faces and eager listeners. She spoke not only about what happened on the subway, but about the importance of standing up against injustice, of refusing to be a bystander in a world that too often turned a blind eye to suffering. Her words were simple, direct, but they resonated deeply with those who heard them. As the weeks went by, Kelly found herself speaking at more events, each one larger than the last. She led self-defense classes, teaching others how to protect themselves and, more importantly, how to protect others. She was no longer just the woman from the subway. She was becoming a symbol of strength and justice, a role model for those who had been too afraid to act before. Throughout all this, Kelly and Evelyn remained in close contact. They would meet regularly, often over a cup of coffee in a quiet cafe. Evelyn, still grappling with her own grief, found solace in Kelly's company. There was a quiet understanding between them, a bond forged in the heat of a shared experience that went beyond words. Together they began to volunteer at local shelters and community centers, working side by side to support those who had been marginalized and forgotten. But the repercussions of that day on the subway didn't end with Kelly's newfound activism. The three young men who had tormented Evelyn were not easily forgotten. The investigation into their actions led back to the university where they were students, a prestigious institution that prided itself on its reputation. The school faced immense public pressure to act, with calls for accountability growing louder as the video continued to circulate. In response, the university launched an inquiry, the results of which were swift and decisive. The three young men were suspended indefinitely, their behavior deemed inexcusable. The school's administration released a statement condemning their actions, emphasizing that such behavior had no place in their community. It was a harsh consequence, but one that reflected the severity of what had occurred. Kelly read about the suspension in the news, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. She had never intended for things to escalate to this level, but she couldn't deny the necessity of it. The young men needed to face the consequences of their actions, to understand the impact of their cruelty. She hoped, in time, they would learn from this, would become better because of it. One evening, as Kelly and Evelyn sat together in the cafe, Evelyn reached across the table and took Kelly's hand. "You've done so much," she said, her voice soft but full of conviction. "Not just for me, but for so many others. I don't know if you realize just how much you've changed things." Kelly squeezed her hand, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I just did what I could," she replied. In the days following the viral spread of the subway incident, the internet buzzed with conversations and reactions. It started with a post from someone claiming to know Evelyn, someone who had been present at the hospital where she had just spent hours beside her daughter. The post revealed the devastating news that Evelyn's grandson, a bright and joyful boy of just 8 years old, had passed away that very morning after a long battle with leukemia. The day of the incident on the subway was the same day Evelyn had said her final goodbye to the child she had adored more than anything in the world. This revelation spread like wildfire across social media. The cruelty of the three young men was no longer seen as just an act of bullying. It was an assault on a grieving grandmother who had just experienced one of the most profound losses imaginable. The public outrage, already simmering, now boiled over into a full-blown storm of indignation. Comments flooded in, expressing shock and sorrow for Evelyn. People who had initially watched the video with a sense of detached interest now felt a deep, personal connection to her pain. Strangers offered condolences, shared stories of their own losses, and rallied around her in a collective show of support. The video was shared even more widely, accompanied by hashtags demanding justice and calling for greater awareness of the impact of such cruelty. As the world learned more about Evelyn's story, The three young men found themselves at the center of an intensifying backlash. Their actions were dissected and condemned across countless platforms, their names now synonymous with heartless cruelty. The pressure on the university where they were students grew, with petitions and open letters demanding accountability for their behavior. But amidst the growing condemnation, something beautiful also began to take shape. A community center for underprivileged children, located in the heart of the city, reached out to Evelyn. They had seen the outpouring of support for her and wanted to offer her a place where she could channel her grief into something meaningful. They invited her to work with the children, to bring her kindness and warmth to those who needed it most. When Evelyn received the invitation, she was overwhelmed. The pain of losing her grandson was still fresh, an open wound that seemed impossible to heal. But the idea of being able to help other children, to be there for them in their moments of need, brought a glimmer of light into the darkness. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected anything really, but the offer felt like a lifeline, a way to find purpose again. Evelyn accepted the position, her heart both heavy and hopeful. The first day she walked into the community center, she was greeted by the bright faces of children who had already endured more hardship than most adults. Their eyes held a mixture of curiosity and wariness, but also a resilience that mirrored her own. As she sat down with them, listening to their stories and sharing a few of her own, Evelyn felt something shift within her. The weight of her grief didn't disappear, but it began to feel a little more bearable, as if the act of giving to others was slowly stitching together the pieces of her broken heart. The community center became a sanctuary for Evelyn, a place where she could give and receive love in equal measure. The children, in turn, grew attached to her, drawn to her gentle nature and the wisdom that came from a life filled with both joy and sorrow. And as the days passed, Evelyn found herself smiling more, the laughter of the children becoming a balm for her soul. The public continued to support her, now even more inspired by her strength and resilience. Messages poured in, not just from those who had followed the story from the beginning, but from new voices, touched by her ability to transform pain into compassion. Evelyn had become more than just a victim. She was a symbol of endurance, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of finding light. Evelyn knew that while she could never forget her grandson, she could honor his memory by helping others. The community center wasn't just a job, it was a new beginning, a place where she could heal, and, in turn, help others heal too. The knock on the door was hesitant, almost uncertain. Kelly, who had been going over the week's plans for the community center, glanced up. Kelly opened the door to reveal the three young men. They looked different from the last time she had seen them, humbled perhaps, or simply worn down by the weight of their recent experiences. The bravado that had once defined them was gone, replaced by a tentative unease. One of them, the ringleader from the subway, cleared his throat. "We came to apologize," he said, his voice rough, as if the words had been difficult to summon. He glanced nervously between Kelly and Evelyn. "To both of you." Evelyn, her expression softening, nodded. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice carrying no trace of bitterness. "I appreciate that." Kelly remained silent for a moment, studying their faces. She could see the strain, the fear of rejection, but also the glimmer of something more, regret, perhaps, or even a desire to make things right. She knew this wasn't easy for them, but an apology, while important, wasn't enough on its own. "You've taken the first step," Kelly said finally, her tone measured. "But words are just that, words. If you really want to make amends, you'll need to show it through your actions." The young men exchanged uneasy glances. "What do you mean?" one of them asked, his voice tentative. Kelly gestured to the room behind her, where the community center's main hall was visible, bustling with activity. "This place runs on the efforts of volunteers," she explained. "People who give their time to help others, to make a difference in the lives of those who need it. If you're serious about making up for what you did, then you'll join them, work here, help out, and prove that you've changed." There was a long pause. The young men shifted uncomfortably, the reality of what she was asking sinking in. This wasn't just a quick fix, a way to get their apology accepted and move on. It was a commitment, a challenge to become better than they had been. Finally, the ringleader nodded. "Okay," he said, his voice firmer now. "We'll do it. We want to do it." Evelyn smiled, a gentle, encouraging smile that held no trace of the pain they had once caused her. "It won't be easy," she warned them kindly, "but it will be worth it." The days that followed were a test of their resolve. The young men were assigned tasks that put them in direct contact with the community they had once overlooked. Elderly residents who needed assistance, children who came for after-school programs, and those who had faced their own struggles with prejudice and hardship. At first, the work was uncomfortable for them. They were faced with the quiet dignity of people who had suffered far more than they ever had, yet still found ways to give back, to offer kindness. It was a stark contrast to the way they had lived, focused on their own needs, their own desires. But gradually, something began to change. The young men started to see the impact of their efforts, the smiles of gratitude, the small improvements in the lives of those they helped. They began to understand that true strength wasn't about dominance or intimidation, but about lifting others up, about making a positive difference in the world. The ringleader, who had once been so full of arrogance, found himself listening more than he spoke, learning from the very people he had once dismissed. The others followed suit, their perspectives shifting as they realized the power of compassion and empathy. Kelly watched their transformation with a critical but hopeful eye. She didn't expect perfection, but she saw genuine growth, a willingness to change, and that, she knew, was the beginning of true redemption. As the weeks turned into months, the young men became a fixture at the center, no longer just volunteers working off a debt, but active, engaged members of the community. They had found a new path, one that led away from their past mistakes and toward a future built on understanding and kindness. And, in the process, they had not only earned Evelyn's forgiveness, but had also gained a deeper respect from Kelly, who had seen in them the potential for real change. The early morning sun filtered through the windows of the community center, casting a warm glow on the scene inside. The three young men, once a source of trouble and pain, were now a familiar sight among the volunteers. They moved with purpose, their actions no longer hesitant or forced, but driven by a newfound commitment to the work they had come to embrace. Over time, they had each found their place within the center. The ringleader, who had once exuded arrogance, now worked diligently with the younger children, his patience and understanding a stark contrast to his former self. The other two had taken to helping the elderly, assisting with tasks that required strength and care, but also a kind of gentleness they hadn't known they possessed. Their transformation hadn't come easily. There had been moments of doubt, days when the weight of their past actions seemed too heavy to bear. But each time, Kelly and Evelyn had been there, guiding them, encouraging them, and reminding them that change was possible if they were willing to work for it. One afternoon, as the center buzzed with activity, Kelly pulled the three aside. She had been watching them closely, noting their progress, their growing dedication. There was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there when they first met. "You've all come a long way," she began, her voice steady. "I'm proud of the work you've done here, but I think it's time we talk about what comes next." The young men exchanged glances, unsure of what she meant. The ringleader spoke up first. "We want to keep working here," he said quickly. "We're not done yet." Kelly smiled, a rare expression for her. "I'm glad to hear that. But there's more to this than just the work you do here. You all have potential beyond these walls, and it's time to start thinking about your future." Evelyn, who had been standing quietly beside Kelly, nodded in agreement. "You've shown us that you're capable of real change," she said softly. "But to truly move forward, you need to complete your education. It's not just about earning a diploma. It's about proving to yourselves that you can overcome the mistakes of your past." The room fell silent as the weight of Evelyn's words sank in. The idea of returning to school, of facing the academic challenges they had once dismissed, was daunting. But it was also an opportunity, one they hadn't thought they would have again. Kelly stepped closer, her gaze firm but kind. "Failure isn't the end. It's just another step. What matters is that you keep going, that you keep trying. We believe in you, and we'll be here to help you every step of the way." Evelyn smiled, her expression filled with warmth. "You've already proven that you can make a difference here. Now it's time to prove it to yourselves." The decision wasn't easy, but it was unanimous. The young men agreed to return to school, to finish what they had started years before. It wasn't just about redemption anymore. It was about building a future they could be proud of. The following weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. Kelly and Evelyn worked closely with them, helping to arrange everything they needed for their return to school: enrollment papers, financial aid, tutoring sessions. The young men threw themselves into the process with the same determination they had brought to their work at the center. And when the day finally came for them to step back into a classroom, they did so with their heads held high. They knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges ahead. But they were ready, armed not only with the skills they had gained at the center, but also with the knowledge that they had the support of Kelly, Evelyn, and an entire community that believed in their potential. As the story drew to a close, the message was clear: everyone deserves a second chance. The three young men had been given an opportunity to change, and they had taken it with both hands, transforming their lives in the process. Kelly and Evelyn continued their work, knowing that the seeds they had planted would grow not just in these three, but in many others who would come after them. Thank you so much for watching this powerful story. It's incredible to see how even in the darkest moments, there's light to be found when we come together as a community. Evelyn's journey is a reminder that strength can be found in the most unexpected places, and that kindness and compassion can truly make a difference. If this story moved you, please consider giving this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring content and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Let's keep the conversation going in the comments. How did this story resonate with you? Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment of kindness that changed your perspective? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And as always, stay positive, stay inspired, and remember, we all have the power to make the world a better place, one small act at a time. See you in the next video.